Misinformation is a social problem, it's a cultural problem, it's a political problem. It's always been there, it probably always will. The question is really, how can we manage it? We have to be discerning. We all need people who we can trust, but we have to be able to make that decision about who are we going to trust in an ongoing way, maturely and in a way that's open to being wrong. We just have to have a little bit more of a nuanced relationship to our sources of information, I think.
Hello, thank you for joining us for this conversation. We are now entering the penultimate week of From Me to We, our learning journey. It's been expansive and transformative, and each session has felt deep and special to be gathered in this way. You're still welcome to join us, and you can catch up on the previous weeks in your own time. In the course library, you'll find the videos from each of the speaker sessions, as well as these really exquisite embodiment practices that Ava Reby Williams leads us through. She takes what has been shared in the speakers' sessions, and we actually really move it through our bodies in a somatic experience. This allows for the words to reach us in places far deeper than just the mind. You're also welcome to join us for the individual speaker sessions live. We have 2 left. We're now moving from collective Dharma into engaged activism, where the guests that we have are Ada Paris, Brother Phap Lin, and Samantha Roddick. We'll be exploring these questions. How can we redefine sacred activism for this moment and embrace the political, ecological, and societal challenges within our understanding of and our commitment to our spiritual practice? And what does community organizing and activism look like when our sense of self is now so global and technological? In other news, for those of you in London or in the UK, we're hosting a picnic for our community. All are welcome. It's on Saturday, June the 18th, and it will be taking place in Hampstead Heath. You just need to register and feel free to bring friends and family. If you head to our events page, then you'll find all the details there. And our app is very close now for more community connections and a place to share away from the eyes of big tech. As you know, this process has been a labor of love, but we are so excited that we are creating this for you. We have now submitted to the App Store, and we will let you know when it's live. In the meantime, you can join our membership through our web platform and start to use the social network there. Our intention is that this is an inspiring space for sharing and exploring the deep questions of our time and everything that stirs in our inner worlds as we navigate this. Being a member also supports the making of this podcast and opens up the dynamics of reciprocity. And when you join, you receive a whole collection of workshops which are designed to support you at this time. This episode is one that speaks to something that I know we are all grappling with. My guest is Marcus Gilroy Ware, an interdisciplinary writer and scholar working on media, politics, technology, and capitalism. He is the author of After the Fact, The Truth About Fake News, which was published in 2020, and Filling the Void, Emotion, Capitalism, and Social Media, which was published in 2017. In this conversation, entitled Knowing in Post-Truth Times, we explore the themes of misinformation, conspiracies, and uncertainty, where we speak to the question, how can we filter and trust information in a world of misinformation? I hope that you enjoy this conversation and it supports you in better understanding these times and how to navigate them. Welcome to All That We Are, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between activism, the sacred, creativity, and regeneration. The spaces where our inner and outer worlds dance. From healing trauma to nature connection, to new technologies to ancient wisdom, it's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a more beautiful future. Despite the challenges we face as a global community or the pressures we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to listen, to ask ourselves the big questions and to share what we are already doing and envisioning, we create the futures of our wildest dreams. And we begin to embody all that we are becoming, and all that is possible. Marcus, it's a delight to welcome you to All That We Are. Thank you for being here with us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'm going to start with our first question, which I already know you're going to disrupt, but let's hear it. What comes to you when I ask you, what are the futures of your wildest dreams?
You know, I think when I hear that question, it makes me very aware of the fact that quite free and forward-thinking way that spirit in which the question is asked invites a certain relationship to my future, which I think is something that I've actually lost. And in a way, it makes me feel kind of wistful and nostalgic for a time when perhaps I did have a kind of stronger relationship to my future. I think actually this is a kind of broader issue that we can discuss and expound upon a bit. But, you know, I suppose in a way, my hope, my wildest dream for my future is to go back to being able to see what that future is and be working towards it and be having a kind of a vision of it that makes me feel good. As I say, it's kind of collective and political and social, but also very, very individual, kind of what ideas, you know, you think you might have that lie ahead of you. And somehow I feel like for a lot of people, our kind of personal aspirations, not material ones, but, you know, personal ones for what kind of lives we want to be living have been kind of taken from us by a sense that everything is so uncertain and unpredictable and fraught, just difficult to kind of make sense of, that having a kind of clear relationship to your future, to your dreams and trying to make them, to realize them becomes, or at least for me, has become impossible. But I work with a lot of young people, and I think I see in them an even worse version of that, given that they are under such pressure to have and to be working on building a future. Whereas, you know, I'm kind of in a position where I have some of the things that they want, and they don't have any of that. And so I think they have it worse. I want us all to have futures that we can see. That's in my wildest dreams, I think, at the moment, as far as I can say, giving you an answer.
When you say that, it brings to me something that I've been really contemplating a lot recently, which is, as somebody born in the 80s, grew up in the 90s and the kind of early noughties, it's like there was this idea that everything was possible. I guess it was a moment in time where life was quite grand because there were credit cards and credit cards were an enabler of all kinds of things. And it was before property prices increased so much. I feel like a lot of expectations that of my age grew up with have been impossible to fulfill unless they've gone into careers that are very much hedge funds and or celebrity, where it might still be possible to live in the kind of house that you grew up in, which at the time might have not even felt like a grand place. But actually now, seeing people that are like moving out of London because they can't afford to stay there, and then moving to these other towns that are getting really full and the housing prices just like being this kind of thing. You see that we've kind of come into this time of deep uncertainty, and then you bring in the climate crisis, and then you know that it's easier for us than it is for people that are working out what to do with their lives at this time. As you said, working in universities, you're really connected to that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I think you have to kind of, everyone's consciousness is formed by the historical moments in which they're kind of formed in general. And I think in a way, what's interesting for our generation is that if you look at our parents, there's a kind of, just in terms of what was happening in the world for them, a sense that they could aspire to things and then those things could actually happen. Some of them could actually happen. For our generation, there's a sense that there was a huge amount of aspiration, but actually, unless you are kind of family money or there's something else, a lot of those things, or you've got a big credit card, you know, a lot of that stuff can't happen, but at least the kind of aspirational mindset is there. And then people born 10, 15 years after that, everything is a struggle. And the kinds of aspirations that, you know, I see the sort of 20-year-olds that I work with leaving, I just want to get a job. almost any job. Like ideally, yes, in the creative industries, because that's the degree that I've done. But I mean, a lot of people don't do that. They go on to become teachers or they do something else, because any stable job that they can get, which gives them some feeling of safety, really, is enough. And actually, the real, making of their futures doesn't come through necessarily through those kinds of aspirations necessarily anyway, right? I mean, I left university having a completely different understanding of what was going to happen in my life than what actually happened. But still, the sense of believing that you have something that stretches out ahead of you and that you are working on, that slipped away from a lot of people. Our intention can be that we want that to return to people. The climate crisis, as you say, sits in the center of that. I can only imagine what it must be like now to be 20 and just be feeling like we didn't make this crisis. And now we're the ones who have to question whether, civilization as we know it can even continue long enough for us to have all the things that our parents and elder siblings even had, which is quite a thing if you think about it.
I mean, I hate to say it, but I don't think that certainty is ever coming back. How can it with climate and also just with the amount of information and knowledge that we have to be so connected to what's happening in all these different countries around the world, and whether what we hear is true or not, and we'll get onto that. But to have scientists looking into all of these different things and to have all of that information available to us just through our fingertips, that we can look up things, that kind of takes away the possibility of that certainty, because there's just too much that we know of how things may evolve.
That's a very interesting point. The idea that there's something comforting about ignorance, and I use the word in the loosest possible sense, right? I mean ignorance in the sense of simply not knowing. That's something that previous generations probably did benefit from, through not having to know everything all at once and simultaneously be reading an op-ed about this and an article about this, and then there's your social feed with all of the other kind of non-informational stuff. Like, I don't need to know that this dog fell in the swimming pool in California or, whatever.
Is the dog all right? Like, yeah, I need to know now.
It's fine. We just think people look at kind of inane stuff. I don't know what these two celebrities are beefing about, and I don't need to know. All of this kind of stuff, which kind of creates a lot of noise. And ironically, while it means knowing about lots more things that are also happening, it also complicates the process of sense making that we might otherwise be able to kind of undertake in order to figure out what our place in the world is. Because, when people are trying to make sense, they don't reach for the sources of information that might be the most trustworthy or relevant. They're reaching for the things that feel the best. And I think we're all guilty of that, but take you further away from the things that might help us find some of that certainty. You see that in areas like health, you see it in areas like what's happening in Ukraine, and also in personal contexts as well. It's really fascinating. There is, the philosophers are always trying to separate knowledge off as its own thing, talk about the philosophy of knowledge and what is it to know, and think about Descartes or whatever. But actually, I don't know that it's really that separable or that simple. There's really just kind of hearing narratives and then a whole other set of decisions to make about how much you're going to kind of accept them or not, that are based on the other things that are already in your head. And it's a kind of very organic process. And a lot of my study of misinformation has actually come from my interest in psychology and in linguistics and in culture, rather than people usually talk about like technology and journalism and those kinds of things when they talk about what can be known. But I think that's also a red herring.
I'd like to come back to this in a moment, because I'm also curious as to like how we can create filter systems, because we're going to naturally, because there's so much information, and how those get created and how much control we actually have over the filter system that we end up living within. Because I sense a lot of it is to do with conditioning and trauma and who we find ourselves around and social economic group, and lots of factors that aren't in that realm of choice. But I wanted to come back just to that question that we started with for a moment, because I can see that it kind of comes across as kind of quite an ungrounded question, like, what are the futures of your wildest dreams? And kind of comes in the space of aspiration. This whole inquiry of what has become all that we are began with a question: what is the future that you choose? And I can see how that's also provocative and misleading because our our relationship with choice is, I mean, it's something that's very much there, like within, say, New Age spirituality, like you choose everything. And yet we know that there are so many factors that we don't choose, and that there is a dynamic of what we can choose and what is just part of what we have to accept. Like, I can't choose a different economic system if I live within this one. I asked that question because in a world where politics fails us, in a world where we can't necessarily trust that our voting system will provide us with representatives that are going to create the future that we choose, then it becomes so important for each of us to have our own vision. When we were working on changing our name this summer and we went down various different paths, we decided that instead of talking about the future, that talking about the futures felt more real, because it's going to be such a diverse experience from here. That there's also that relationship between our personal future and our collective future as a species. And then there's also, this thing of, that we are our ancestors' wildest dreams, that we are living a life that has more freedom and more opportunity, perhaps depending on circumstances, than those that have come before us. Although I'm also questioning how true that is. I know, for example, as a woman, like if I look through an Indian ancestral lineage, I have a huge amount more freedom than any woman that has come before me in that lineage. But then there's always all these other factors as to what could be better. But it's kind of inviting in that possibility of what happens if we live from that place of like, okay, we are our ancestors' wildest dreams. And so what can we create with it? What is the role of vision and us holding personal and collective vision within the space that we find ourselves into? And how does that shape the future?
I think that's a really good question. It's not an easy thing to answer. I mean, I love the idea of vision in terms of how we think about what those collective plural futures are. I mean, vision is connected to the question of imagination. What we are able to imagine for those futures is kind of actually a really, really critical and important thing to be focusing on now. When my book came out, I was being asked a lot, the book points out a lot of things that are wrong with the world and tries to make an analysis of them. One of the hardest but best questions I got asked was, well, what should we do? What should we be doing about all this? Originally, I had planned to add another chapter that was kind of going to answer that question. Then I realized that was a whole book worth of work in itself, if not several, and many other conversations as well.
And for our friends listening, this is your most recent book that you're talking about, which is After the Fact, The Truth About Fake News, somewhat cheekily named.
Yes, its title does exactly what it talks about. And the title is not really what the book is, but we can talk about that in a bit. But I think the thing that kept coming up when I was being asked, so what should we do then? And there were several things, but one of the main ones was the imagination, that things can't change until people are able to imagine a different future. And if you, like I am, are a critic broadly of the system of capitalism, the first thing people always say to you is, well, what would you replace it with? And suddenly they place on your shoulders this kind of impossible task of sketching out a completely, with all the gaps filled in, a kind of completely functioning alternative to the systems we live by, to a greater or lesser extent, born into. Sometimes when you criticize capitalism, people say things like, well, communism was worse, and other things like that. All of these kind of silly responses point to me to a failure of that imagination. And actually, we need to be kind of having our wildest dreams about what the world could be before are expected to come to any kind of coherent answer that might actually point us in the direction of what the future will be. We have to be kind of thinking actually quite fancifully about what it might be or what it could be or what would be great, and really kind of questioning and often throwing away a lot of the things we take for granted. I've been criticized for relying too heavily on Mark Fisher in my work, and maybe those are justified criticisms, but one of the things that he's kind of well known for saying, and when he died, his students went outside and took these lines from his book and wrote them on the wall of Goldsmiths. But there's a sense of questioning the things that are deemed to be inevitable and making them seem possible, or rather the things that are considered to be impossible, making them seem attainable, and the things that are kind of considered inevitable, actually saying, well, maybe do we need to do these things after all? And kind of just actually really challenging some of the kind of fundamental assumptions that if you're kind of accustomed to criticizing the system by which we live, then maybe that comes naturally, or that's part of that process. But I think a lot of people want to survive. We've created a world in which a lot of people are trying to survive, and their sense of their dreams is very incremental. They have this amount of their overdraft. Next year, they might have paid a bit more off. That's the extent of like long-term improvement for a lot of people, and then there's the kind of, if I won the lottery situation, right? And there's a huge gap between where they are and where they would like to be. Doing that work collectively is even harder, thinking about here's where we are now with all these crises, and here's how great society could be. It just seems kind of almost like a bit of a la-la land for people. It's very abstract. It's very hard to think of like a concrete other world that's not the one we're in. It's often famously said it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. I guess I'm calling for a completely different kind of conversations for people to have, where, the kind of rather emotive relationship that people have in terms of clinging to the fundamentals of the way things are organized at the moment can be sort of calmed down a bit, and we can be thinking in a more patient and calm way about what would it look like if we did this. Okay, you don't like that, that's fine. Okay, well, how about this? And be having kind of almost revolutionary conversations, but in a much more trusting way than I think I usually see. I mean, even the left, who've been criticizing capitalism for 160 years and counting, are notoriously kind of riven with sectarian disagreements and infighting about exactly what that future could look like, or what it should be like, or can we work with capitalism, or could we not, or all those kinds of things. So I'm not saying please can't we all just get along, but I am also saying please can we make the collective project of imagining a better world a higher priority, but also there's an intertanglement, isn't there, between that collective future that we need to set about imagining and the personal one that says, okay, actually those wildest dreams that you have now become attainable because upward mobility exists again, or climate crisis has been managed, we've managed to find a way to handle that, or, then we can all, and we would all start dreaming again in a way that I think a lot of us have lost for the time being. And I don't mean to be overly gloomy, by the way, but I think my students know that I do this a lot. I think you have to look the beast in the eyes first, and then you can have very hopeful conversations about what can be built and what will happen. But, one of the things I look at in my research is denial. I think the hard part about some of what I'm suggesting is that we kind of need to move through that, and moving through denial is never easy.
Yeah, I really feel that that's part of what is happening during this time, and what 2 years of the pandemic has kind of done. It's taken away a lot of those aspirations or wishful thinking, and it's kind of brought us into much smaller lives. In those smaller lives, we're kind of able to both appreciate more of what we have and also acknowledge like what may never be. And part of that feels like some of the repair work of living in an over consumerized society where we feel like everything's going to be possible to buy, and there will be a moment where somehow this money will arrive from somewhere to be able to do this thing and to do that thing. And I feel like there has been a moment for many people of like, okay, it's this and it's hard. And then somehow national insurance rises, like squeeze, energy bills rise, the squeezing just kind of happens even more. And we're kind of called into really coming into a space of reality and deepening our appreciation of what we have. And then within that, it's like, how do you keep vision alive? Or how do you actually use that process of coming out of denial and coming into a kind of complete relationship with what's in front of you, and also be able to collectively vision?
I don't know. I think that's very difficult, because the harder things get, the more people move into survival mode and kind of lose touch with that bit of themselves. I think you're right that the pandemic, I mean, things were already bad. Prior to the pandemic, we already had the climate crisis, we already had other things. But, everything is kind of put relatively. So now the world prior to the pandemic seems somehow, I mean, just on a personal note, I remember the beginning of 2020, just really think, you know how you get very kind of hokey at New Year and you sort of think, well, this year I'm going to be a new me. And I mean, those things are very important, but often they happen. Like, why do they need to happen in early January? They could happen at any time. But anyway, I was having an early January-ish kind of moment and thinking, I'm just going to rush into things and I'm going to stop being so kind of risk averse and all the rest of it. And then like 6 weeks later, this bloody pandemic started. So now I look back at that and I think, what was the thing that enabled me to imagine taking a different approach? It was something that now the pandemic has kind of made so much, even going into a space with other people is something that a lot of people feel kind of reserved about still. So, I don't know. I mean, a long time ago, I was at Goldsmiths and we were talking about politics in a sort of group. And I said, well, how bad do things have to get before they start getting better? And somebody turned to me and said, that's the question of our time. And I was like, it's a bit of a penny drop moment, but I fear they may have been right. The thing about the economic side of these things, cost of living, prices and so forth, is that, I mean, there may be less available wheat grains in the world at the moment or whatever, but it's so artificial. The fact that we should now be paying a certain amount for a loaf of bread or whatever, when last year we were paying less. It's all because of, capitalists decided it should be that way. Just a law of supply and demand. Oh, there's less, more people want it. Therefore, we can jack the prices up. Somewhere there's a commodities trading, setup where those decisions are being made, and they're being made depending on how cynical you think they are, either in full knowledge that that's going to cause people around the world to go hungry, or with some kind of denial, some kind of way, some kind of mechanism that enables people to sort of block out that aspect of the thinking about that. But, this is a thing that human beings are doing that's having an impact on other human beings. So much of it is kind of not inevitable. It really doesn't have to be that way. If not now, then when? Things should be ripe for us to be talking about, well, why are we doing this to each other? Why does our food have to pass through a commodities trading market? Why can't farmers just farm things and we eat them? And we organize systems for distributing them properly. I don't know. Now I'm sounding very kind of 19th century, but actually, it doesn't have to be this way at all, does it?
No, but I don't know what it takes to fully break the system. Helena Norberg Hodge talks about corporations as like non-human machines. We find ourselves like in a war that humans are very much not winning with these machines, with these corporations that of course have human beings working in them, but those human beings aren't able to show up fully as human beings in those roles. And so there's a decision somewhere that company's profits is more important than whatever that price hike is going to do for other human beings along the line. I don't know how that breaks.
That's very interesting. I mean, I think that for me, that kind of raises the question of agency. One of the sort of areas that I'm fascinated by in my work is what we call conspiracy theories. And there was a sort of, I think, a realization for me that often the structure is the conspiracy, not the person, right? We're always looking for that kind of bad guy in a high back chair with a white cat, stroking their head and kind of laughing to themselves because we imagine everything is human agency. And, I stand by what I just said. I think it is all human beings doing things to other human beings. However, I think the structures by which we have organized that mean that if you fire the boss and bring in another boss or whatever, if any one of those people is removed and replaced with somebody else, the system continues because it's the structure that's kind of organized in a kind of in a way that produces these kinds of outcomes. The system is designed to keep itself stable and not to be dependent on any kind of one person. So I started out by looking at kind of social media corporations, but then realized that they have a lot more in common with, junk food and tobacco corporations than they have with, other software companies. What Facebook, for example, is doing, or even Zoom that we're on, what the way that they run their businesses are pretty awful. The mistake that's often made is that we go back to we just say, well, they're bad, and that is a new thing in the world that's bad. And actually, I think the things that the corporations we're dealing with now in the digital world are traceable back to the kind of dawn of capitalism in the sort of, 16th century. So actually, if you want to kind of understand them properly, you have to put them back into that kind of full context and realize that we've made a world that made those things both possible and likely. And then the rest, in a way, shouldn't be a surprise. the question then, just as I said, comes back to then how do we get rid of that? But there's this sort of weird collective agency where we're sort of collectively making decisions without any of us realizing that we're doing that. I mean, let's take the climate emergency. Flying is bad. We know that flying is a thing we could stop doing, or a lot of us could stop doing, and that would make a difference to the climate. But we all keep flying. And each one of us thinks, oh, just one more little holiday, or, one business trip, or whatever. And it is heavily, unequal. So not everyone is doing this the same amount, but we're collectively prolonging the whole thing and making a decision that flying should not, in fact, stop or even decline. So whose agency is at work there? Is it everyone? Is it no one? Does it have to be conscious, or can we kind of unconsciously do this? I mean, another environmental example, I thought the whole plastic drinking straws thing was interesting. Like, of course, if there's plastic ending up in the seas and we can stop that from ending up in the seas, then we should stop it. And like, if there are ways to make drinking straws that are not plastic, then we should do that. And we have, and that's great. Plastic drinking straws make up less than 1% of the plastic that's ending up in the sea. Meanwhile, people are ordering a Deliveroo every night in containers. Every night, someone somewhere is ordering a Deliveroo in plastic containers.
Many people.
Many people are doing that, and they're coming in plastic containers that are technically recyclable, but people are they're not reusing them. There's way more plastic happening in way more places, and there is like literally zero conversation about that kind of consumption.
And the impact of moving from plastic to cardboard is that more trees are being cut down in order to create the paper straws. And so we don't have a full understanding of the impact.
Well, and who's even making the decision that in order for us to make paper straws, we have to cut down new trees? Why can't we just be like, paper is way more recyclable than plastic, for example. And, we've known the science on that for a very long time. We've been making paper for like thousands of years. We know exactly how it's made. It doesn't even have to be that way. And yet, again, it's not you or me voting. It's shareholders voting. It's a completely different set of interests and a completely different set of decision-making processes that are kind of in the machine we're generally not really very familiar with. So yeah, I don't know.
We are taking just a short pause here. If you are enjoying this episode, please consider joining our community. For a small contribution, you can be part of our beautiful online world, where we deepen the conversation and offer spaces of learning and practice. As a member, you are a patron supporting the making of this show, and you receive a number of benefits, such as special member-only events and discounts on all our courses, retreats, and in-person experiences. You will have membership to our app and connect with inspiring humans around the world through a social network to discuss the themes of the show away from the eyes of advertisers and the manipulation of big tech. Our membership is what makes us able to stay advertising free in a world that is always trying to sell us stuff we don't need. And it is the very heart of all that we are. Head to www.allthatweare.org/support to find out more. I feel like this theme of misinformation is such an important one of this time. Many people call this the time of post-truth, that sense of who can you trust, what information can you trust, and why do certain people get given certain kinds of bits of information. Things that are labeled conspiracy theories have definitely happened, not necessarily all the lizard ones, but some of the other ones of what was a conspiracy theory and unthinkable. It has happened. It's a really interesting time, and I know that all of our friends in this community that listen to this podcast, there's a curiosity to explore what life is at this time, and there's a desire for sense making. At the same time, a little bit of overwhelm as to how one does that. I'm really curious to hear more about your work on misinformation and fake news and what is actually happening.
One of the things I felt, so as Trump was elected in 2016, I was finishing my first book, which was about social media companies and the things that they do. And the last chapter, the bit that I was working on just as that happened, was about social media and politics. And so I was paying a lot of attention to kind of the sense making that was happening in terms of, a lot of people just had no idea that Trump was even had any chance of being elected, including a lot of people who otherwise I probably have quite similar to, political views to them. And this was just a massive shock. How could this have happened? Besides the kind of shock and the outrage, there was also kind of actually, well, there is a story of exactly how this happened. And it's one, okay, hindsight's 2020, but a lot of us probably should have been, more kind of engaged with than we were. So the fact that something so momentous and terrible was able to happen kind of right under our noses and be such a shock to so many people suggested to me that already there was kind of a veil that was hung there that was stopping us from seeing the things that we thought we understood well about how the world works. Brexit, kind of a similar thing in a way. But then, especially after Trump, there was also a recognition that there's misinformation out there, which sounds like a good thing. But then what I realized is that a lot of the kind of sense making that was done about misinformation leading up to that kind of tragedy was wrong. People kind of had various views about, oh, it's the kids in Macedonia who are manufacturing fake news for profit, or, it's the Russians and their divisive campaigns, or it's Facebook's fault. And I'm, amongst Facebook's main critics, but the idea that fake news on Facebook is itself responsible for Trump being elected is at best a huge simplification, oversimplification. So in other words, what I realize is that, yes, there is misinformation that needs to be understood, and we can use some of that hindsight to do that. But there's also a lot of misinformation about misinformation. And as we try to make sense of a problem like misinformation and the kinds of outcomes it leads to, what we realize is that sense making itself can lead to certain forms of misinformation. What was needed was a much more kind of expansive and open definition of what misinformation even is. I wanted to look at like self-reproducing forms of thinking in a way that would lead us to both not see that a problem like that was building and to carry on doing the things that are making the problem get worse. There was a lot of work to do there, because obviously, like, why did Trump happen? Is it because of the Russians? Is it because of Facebook? Or is it because of like the history of neoliberalism, which, I mean, a technical word, basically structuring everything for your listeners who aren't familiar with the word neoliberalism, structuring everything around the logic of the market, everything in society, politics, institutions, civil society, even sociality, giving everything 5-star ratings and everything is an exchange and everyone's trying to screw everyone else over. That's neoliberalism. That system, which has kind of been with us for about 80 years or so, has its own history, which has kind of, led to a lot of people being quite angry in our present moment. And that's got a kind of multi-generational story of its own. What I thought was that, one, we don't understand that story very well. So in the first chapter of my book, I try to kind of tell the story, but also we're like being in a car without the headlights on at night, like not seeing where we're going as a society. And I think that comes back to some of the stuff we were saying earlier about imagining collective futures. It's like your car has a warning light that tells you when something's wrong. If your car doesn't have a warning light and you carry on driving it, it's going to break. And I feel like our society was a bit like that there were forms of misinformation that kind of blocked our ability to see that we're headed for a seized up engine or headed over a cliff or whatever, And yeah, so if you throw that together with the kind of history of propaganda, the fact that there's a huge amount of money and power, kind of whether it's the war in Iraq or the tobacco industry or many other things, there's a lot of money and power invested in making sure that we don't know where we're going as a society. Together also with the need for human beings to make sense of a very complicated and distressing world. And the fact that, when we do sense making, we don't go to authoritative sources. I've been kind of taken in by misinformation. I'm happy to kind of admit that. I think we all have been at some point. There's no shame in that. The shame is in not accepting it and not allowing yourself to kind of, okay, me too, So sense making is prone to misinformation. As you say, there are conspiracies in the world. They're not always the ones people suspect. In fact, the difference there is really interesting. But there are conspiracies in the world. I mean, The history of the tobacco industry is one of the best conspiracies going. The Volkswagen emission scandal, even social media. If you understand what their business really is and the way it works, it's frighteningly similar amongst the worst conspiracy theories. The history of light bulbs even is a kind of stitch up. The Phoebus cartel and kind of the light bulb manufacturers from all around the world agreeing that they're going to make light bulbs that break. Widely documented, the subject of mainstream documentaries, like not even remotely controversial, but somewhat surprising if you don't know that history. I'm realizing now I sound like a conspiracy nut, but honestly, like it is true.
You don't. You haven't mentioned any lizards.
Well, no. But what is interesting actually about the lizards is that rather than discover or even just read about this stuff, which, whistleblowers and investigative journalists and other people have been uncovering for us, often at great personal cost for years, they would rather believe in lizards. The sort of Hollywoodization of our imagination means that we would rather believe in lizards and invisible microchips that don't exist and aren't be possible and all sorts of other things than actually kind of look at what's under their noses in terms of the real conspiracies that are really happening. I did a deep dive into kind of stuff about 5G masts and, was quite surprised to find, because I was perfectly open to the idea that stuff is really harmful. And Bristol, where I live, is one of the first cities where it was rolled out. Found that most of the papers people were citing about the harmfulness of that is actually about the harmfulness of background electromagnetic radiation from cell phones generally, which also applies to earlier generations of cell reception. There's very, very, very little to suggest that 5G is any worse. It's not great for our bodies, but also then there's like a mainstream science position, which is kind of hard to refute, that actually, non-ionizing radiation can't harm you in the same ways that we imagine when we hear the word radiation, we're going to be harmed. You hear radiation, you think of Chernobyl, right? And therefore, electromagnetic radiation is bad. But there's different kinds of radiation. So anyway, I don't want to be kind of going down to the details of one specific thing, but just to say that actually, what we think we know about the world and the ways in which we are being harmed and the ways in which we think we're being harmed don't line up. And they don't line up for anyone. If you're a big science wizard, then your politics is probably not very strong. If you're in the political machine, maybe your science isn't very strong. None of us are 100% super literate about the world. And all of us are in a position of sense making from a position of partial ignorance at the very least.
And the filters that we have on in how we understand the world and what information comes to us and what information sources we trust.
Well, exactly, because in the moments of trust, you go to your family and friends. You don't go to a peer-reviewed journal when you're trying to make sense of the world, unless that's your job. And even peer-reviewed journals make mistakes sometimes. So it's very hard to know who to trust. And then there's the kind of sense of power and where you sit in a society. And what's so interesting to me is that I do think that conspiracy theories come from a feeling of disempowerment. But what's also interesting is that feeling of disempowerment doesn't have to kind of coincide with real disempowerment. So even, Trump and sort of very empowered, rich, white Americans, they have amongst the more conspiratorial mindset because they imagine an even more powerful entity that is conspiring against them, even though it doesn't exist. There's always got to be something that you feel belittled by in order for you to sort of enter that mindset as part of your sense making. But power is a very important thing. And I think generally our relationship to power is very problematic. And what I tried to show is that you can't understand misinformation unless you place it in the context of power relations in the world. So then if you throw, social media back into that, of course, there's going to be stuff on Facebook that people are sharing that, is not true and is misleading and is maybe causing people to kind of, go without treatments that they possibly need and things like that. But that's one or two jigsaw pieces from a much, much bigger puzzle, from 1,000-piece jigsaw. I want to be kind of stitching that puzzle back together. Mixed metaphors here. I want to be doing the puzzle, putting all the pieces back together so that we can kind of understand what the big picture of misinformation really is. That's why in the book, I only come to social media corporations as the last chapter, because I was trying to kind of refute and push back against this idea that social media itself is the reason why we have fake news. No, it's not. It's definitely a kind of lubricant. It definitely paves the way for that stuff to spread much more quickly. But if you want to know why it happens and where it's coming from and how we stop it, then I think you have to kind of go into the politics and the sociology of it much more than the technology in a way is the least interesting bit. Even with social media corporations, the technology is unremarkable, even when impressive. The thing we should be paying attention to is their business and the fact that we should have learned 50 years ago from the antics of the tobacco companies what every business would be looking like. So yeah, I mean that's the kind of story of misinformation. There's so much more to say. I mean, one of the things that you find is that there are just these thinking processes that we're really accustomed to. One of them is the Manichaean pattern of always imagining there's a good side and a bad side, that everything is good and evil, which I think really allows people to kind of not question themselves and their own complicity often in making the very things in the world that they claim to be against. And where I found that to be most true, or most surprisingly true, was not to the left or to the right, but actually that there's a lot of kind of fluffy liberal stuff at the center where people can't possibly imagine a world in which their actions are leading to the very things that they claim to be against. And there's really no interest in that self-criticism. I mean, a really good example of that was during the Black Lives Matter, eruption that happened in June 2020, the Council of the European Union put out a sort of press release affirming their support of Black Lives Matter. And I just thought, like, God, how arrogant and blind can you be that the European Union has been allowing brown people to die and condemning them to death in the Mediterranean for years as a matter of policy. And then you turn around and say Black Lives Matter like it's nothing, and then just jump on a bandwagon. So I look at a lot of stuff like that as well, a kind of like double thinking, kind of lack of self-awareness where, people probably mean well, their heart's in the right place, but the misinformation is about their own circumstances and their own complicity. And again, I think there's probably a version of that going on in all of us. So, I mean, misinformation is a social problem. It's a cultural problem. It's a political problem. It's always been there. It probably always will. The question is really, how can we manage it? Rather than saying, well, people are ignorant and therefore they need to learn more, which I think is both elitist and also very simplistic. The thing that I try to call for is more like literacy rather than learning. So it's the sense that, like, actually, whatever you can know it in a kind of isolated way, or you can be thinking kind of about the world in motion and thinking about how those things that connect with one another. One of the things conspiracy theorists often get right is this sense that actually everything is connected, and that if this happens over here and this happens over here, on the other side, the idea that they have nothing to do with each other at all is not something you should just accept without being sure. But you also need to be ready to accept, okay, in this case, they really don't have anything to do with each other. So it's like this sense of knowing when you don't know, allowing yourself to feel humble in the face of knowledge rather than in the face of some kind of imagined conspirator who may not exist.
And can we also just acknowledge how overwhelming it is to live at a time where this is how information exists in the world? We were talking about just the struggle in general earlier on in this conversation. It's tricky because we want to be able to focus on what's most important to us and to make good decisions for ourselves, for our family, for our community. It would be much simpler to live in a time where, like, the BBC did feel like a gospel, like a public service, like that was just information to help you get on with your life. And yet that's not the world that we live in. It can be exhausting to try and make sense, make good decisions, and not, as you said, fall into certain narratives that may be conspiracies, or they're very much in the mainstream dominant narrative that may be causing harm. We're being asked as human beings to live in a very complicated time where there's so many agendas and just like little things like language that's used in certain articles over language in others. So, for example, one that I saw this morning was in the New York Times, and it's got like two headlines, and it says, Brent Renaud, an American journalist, is killed in Ukraine. And then it shows you Shireen Abu Akleh, Palestinian journalist, dies, age 51. Like, you just see those headlines because you're busy, and something different's happening in your body in terms of your reaction. And so we're constantly finding ourselves in this as well, where there's always some kind of agenda, and it can play out in such subtle ways where the use there of the word killed and dies like really does have a big impact, yet it doesn't seem like such a big thing. And that's a very, very tiny thing in all of the streams of information that we find ourselves in and that we're trying to understand. I don't expect you to know the answer to this, but I know the question that everyone listening is going to have is, how do we live our lives? How do we find information sources that are going to enable us to live in deeper service of a kind of future that we want to live in? Or is part of it a real deep acceptance that this is where we are? And that perhaps misinformation has always been part of being a human, just it came in different ways. We've all seen propaganda posters from wartime, and colonialism was a big exercise of misinformation in itself.
Oh, for sure, for sure. I mean, how else can a small violent minority come in and make, millions and millions and millions of people do what they want without also deploying the tools of not only misinformation, but disinformation, right? Deliberately misleading people who are possibly vulnerable to that in specific ways. Definitely, colonialism is partly achieved by those means. When you were speaking, I was thinking, I don't know anyone who is coping with kind of how to make sense of the world, myself included. I don't think this is a thing like healthy eating, where you sort of can do it if you really want to.
Even that's not so easy.
No, it's really difficult. Although I believe it's possible, but it's definitely a struggle, right? Whereas I think if you spend all your waking hours reading articles and learning, you'd be great on a pub quiz team, but actually you'd be miserable. And I think you also still wouldn't get to the bottom of it. So I think, the mature thing to do is kind of accept that our worldview will always be partial. And I mean that in both senses of the word partial. I mean that in the sense that it's not complete, but also, in the sense that maybe you are taking one side or another, and perhaps you feel you have good reasons to do that. But I would defend taking a side. But your worldview will always be partial in that way. And secondly, I think, now it's very kind of fashionable to hear about people in offices having to do unconscious bias training. But I do think it's very important for us to be aware of the unconscious nature of this. There are agendas in newsrooms. I saw that same thing with those two headlines, and I was shocked, if not really surprised, because it's the New York Times, and that's the way they've reported, Israel-Palestine for decades. And so maybe there's an agenda there, but in general, if you look at the kind of structures and systems of knowledge, of official knowledge, I'm not going to jump on the bandwagon and saying that, scientists are all corrupt and journalists are all liars and all the rest of it. I don't think you can make those kinds of generalizations. I think there are some really amazing people in those professions, and they may even be the majority. But there's also enough cynicism, particularly amongst journalists who I know much better. There's a lot of other things going on that are not just like, we have the information, we're going to frame it for you, and then you're going to believe what we say. A chapter in my book about this as well, but I realized that it's not like you've got the masses who are all idiots and don't know anything, and then the people in the newsroom who've got the information. It's actually like, really what we've got is that there's idiots in the newsroom and idiots in the public, or rather the sense that everybody is misinformed. And so if you have quite arrogant, misinformed people in the newsroom, and then other misinformed people kind of out in public reading the newspaper or watching the nightly news, you just have a feedback loop of more and more misinformation that's being kind of dressed up as though it's reputable in some way, and then it just gets recycled. And I think particularly long-standing political issues like Israel-Palestine, yes, there's a lot to say about that, but a lot of it is also the structures of knowledge that we have about those things are not self-questioning, particularly when things get really polarized. When there's two sides and they won't even talk to each other, you have a situation in which one side can't really allow itself to be questioned by people who might disagree. And I don't want to sound like I'm just doing the whole like Elon Musk freedom of speech, disagreement is sacred and all the rest of it. What I mean is that it's sort of a version of the echo chambers argument, but away from social media, just the sense that we create these kinds of, self-congratulatory knowledge systems that are either completely amazing and great and reliable, or, you can't trust journalists, you can't listen to a word they say, mainstream media is corrupt, blah, blah, blah. I think a bit of maturity there is really helpful. Like, there's aspects of the mainstream media that I rely on. There's other aspects I completely distrust. Depends on the columnist or the writer. It depends on the outlet. It depends on the relationship I've formed with that outlet over many years, quite often. And so I suppose the second answer to your question is that we have to be discerning. There's too many people on YouTube who are willing to offer us what we want to hear about COVID or about climate change or about something else. We all need people who we can trust, but we have to be able to make that decision about who are we going to trust in an ongoing way, maturely and in a way that's open to being wrong. I mean, this is the huge kind of thing with the difference between an investigative journalist who works on a story for 2 years and a conspiracy theorist is that the former is open to being wrong. And they take a huge amount of care to make sure to triple check everything because they know they're only as good as their last expose, their last story. Whereas the conspiracy beliefs generally are characterized by a sense of being non-falsifiable. So as soon as you have any evidence to the contrary, you then become part of the conspiracy as well. And I think that's the kind of thing, that kind of lack of reflexivity and that inability to be mature about the source of our information that really fuels the misinformation problem. But it's also in itself the symptom of decades of mistrust that have built up. The best people to follow are the people who you think are right 75% of the time. You just have to be able to kind of form the structures that you need to be able to know which is the 25% when you're not going to listen. Even a broken clock is right twice a day, So we just have to have a little bit more of a kind of nuanced relationship to our sources of information, I think.
Yeah, certainty sells in a time where there's so much uncertainty.
Oh, absolutely.
Everybody wants the person that knows to be in their life. And that's why cults have survived and been so alluring for the whole of time, because it's really comforting to be around somebody that knows what's going on.
Definitely. And, those of us who knew virologists, who were close personal friends with well-established virologist, probably really benefited from that. Because the question about who to trust in that situation, if you happen to have a close friend who's already been doing this for 20 years, is obvious. But for the rest of us, it's kind of, as you say, it's much more difficult and much harder to access that kind of certainty. One of the other things we haven't really spoken about yet in relation to that, and in relation to the fact that, most people don't have that luxury, is escape. Because what's social media filled with? Maybe it has conspiracy theories and it has misinformation, but it also has a lot of non-informational content, which I think is very, very important. Like Instagram is full of people escaping through their hobbies, through their holidays, through just random memes or whatever. You look at Netflix, the amount of screen time that we all were doing absolutely boomed during the pandemic. But even prior to that, it's not uncommon for people to spend 3 hours a day on their phone. There's a much bigger economy of escape, gaming, TV streaming services, then other forms of self-medication as well. So then when you're escaping, you're also not making sense of your circumstances, right? Or thinking about your future or any of these other things. You're just kind of drifting away from it in the complete opposite direction. But I'm a defender of escape up to a point. But I think the harsher the circumstances, the more likely it becomes that we'll over-escape, that we kind of opt out. And then you can start to kind of lose control over other aspects of your life or whatever. But I think escape is a thing that people need to kind of keep an eye on. This, I think you do have a kind of responsibility to a certain extent to try to be learning something every day, really, if you can. If you have any time at all to and from work, listening to the radio, anything, because completely escaping from that, I don't know. I think that's shirking a certain kind of responsibility. But that sounds like a moralistic utterance, and I don't want it to come across that way. But escape is important, but too much of it takes us away from the problem.
Yeah, there's also something about the level of nuance in these times that we're living in. I used to post quite a lot on social media. I make this podcast, so there's that space for a deeper contemplation and inquiry. And when I open Instagram now, I don't know how one could even begin to share what I'm exploring and what I'm making sense of and what I'm feeling. So I do just post photographs of my puppy, because then there's some connection.
But maybe that's what we all need. We all need pictures of Sambo. Just keep them coming.
And then I realized that, I'm like, oh, wow, I haven't said anything very interesting on this medium. And it's like, well, that's also okay, because not all of those processes need to be shared. And they don't all have answers as well.
No, they don't. And in a way, what is there to say anyway? We're talking about the struggle to make sense of things, but I think there's a sort of parallel struggle of how to articulate what we even feel in relation to a lot of what's going on. It's like, I mean, if words don't do it, then emojis or a picture with a caption also isn't going to do it. These tools are not designed in any case for us to express our rage and frustration and confusion, or our hope, or our sense of radical possibility. They're not designed for that at all. They're designed to keep other people watching and keep other people scrolling. That's all. Your struggle to know what to post, I think, is a very apt one. I think it's a very understandable one. It's like searching for a question that has no answer. I never know what to post either. I just post pictures of like bad oil paintings and like various professional engagements and stuff like that, because there's nothing to say. You know, our language doesn't even begin to do justice to the circumstances we're in. This is why we need great writers and poets and songwriters, I think, to kind of do it for us, really.
That takes time, it takes consideration. And I feel that that's part of what's so challenging about social media, is that it's instant. I used to love writing Instagram posts, and I used to take real time to feel into them and to write them, and they felt like poetic expressions. And then now with the algorithms, the way that it's just like, well, what's the point in doing that? It used to be a communication, an expression within like friendship groups. And now it's something kind of different, and it's hard to know how to use that. And also, I don't really want all of my deepest realizations to be mined by companies to work out what to sell me. Like, that's also not how I want to live.
No. I don't want them to be mined, and I also don't want half the world to know them. There's also the question of like, with whom are you sharing, you know, on those kinds of platforms as well. But yeah, especially the idea that they become the sort of fodder for a set of essentially industrial processes, you know, pseudo-industrial processes for making other people pay attention halfway around the world. Yeah, it's not a very comforting feeling, is it, really? When you think you want to have a kind of genuine connection with people who aren't in the same place, then obviously we turn to digital tools to do that. And that's very understandable. I think that there's a real cruelty on some deep level built into social media tools, that they promise something, which is, you know, a bit of entertainment, connecting with others, maybe even some of that escape I was talking about, but actually it's all a ruse. It's all a ruse, and it's widely documented. Shoshana Zuboff's book on this is excellent. And this is what my other book is about.
That's filling the void.
That promise that they make is a broken promise. Yeah.
One of the things that feels really important to reiterate that you've shared in different ways throughout this conversation is that this is a time where we have to be easy on ourselves and on each other around what we believe and why we believe it, and allow for that, I want to say, plasticity around knowledge. Like, that, I don't know if that's the right word, but that we're all being shaped by this information. It might clearly be misinformation, and that's okay. And we need to really not live in a world that's so full of shame and judgment around that, so that we allow ourselves to grow and to share and to explore and to mature as a constant process in how we're relating with the world.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I really think that's important. And, you know, I have my view of the world, but I mean, I think there's a certain kind of like American liberal view of the world, which is that like, it's the sort of Elon Musk thing of like, well, you know, disagreement is productive and we have to be able to bounce off each other or whatever. That may be true up to a point, although I think it's kind of simple. But I do think that a patience with each other and acceptance that like disagreement will happen is just really important. Like, one of the things that seems to have happened is that we've lost the ability to disagree respectfully with each other. I think that quickly needs to be brought back. That's one of the more immediate things that we could be learning how to do, or relearning how to do. You know, everyone kind of needs to know in their head what their own threshold is. You know, I at this point, like, have very little patience with listening to, for example, like white supremacist conspiracy theory about the Great Replacement. Like, if somebody comes out with that, then to me, the conversation is over. But that's where I set my line. But you know, for example, I've spoken to other like right-wing people with very different views to mine, who have like right-wing economic theories, for example. I think they're totally wrong, but I can establish a rapport with them and we can have a conversation about it. In the public health crisis, you encounter a lot of different views on treatment and medicine. And again, I think that needs to be a productive disagreement and series of conversations where we can hopefully all learn something. It sounds trite, but I think it's really important to kind of like reestablish that. I think there's a writer I like called Jason Stanley, who's a philosopher and has kind of written a little bit about what's happening in America. And he puts it well. He says, you know, in an American context, I think he says something like, well, you and I can disagree about the finer points of, you know, the Obamacare plan. But if you think that Barack Obama is a kind of secret Islamist spy who's been sent to bring down the United States.
Or a rent boy that was saved from the streets and turned into a president.
Yeah, or a rent boy. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, then our conversation is not going to be productive, right? If that's the level at which we're disagreeing, then it's like sometimes people are just a little too far away. But then if you can't understand that or engage with that, the next best thing we can do is kind of try to understand how that person got to that point. And I think we can also do that to ourselves. I know what my worldview is, but I also kind of have tried to take the time to understand how I came to have that worldview, you know, where my parents have had an impact by raising me in a certain way. I try to at least acknowledge that that's happened, where I've, you know, seen something shocking, I don't know, radicalize me in a particular way. I've tried to also make sure that I've understood that process, you know, and I think that's a conversation we can have with ourselves to make sure that that we're kind of aware our positions have come from. Because, you know, the reactionary thing, and you see this a lot in politics, but I think reactionaryism is everywhere, is the sense that like you have a quite strong emotional reaction against something else, and then that becomes your political view. Somebody said something once that angered you, and they said they were a feminist, so now you're an anti-feminist or whatever. And you see a lot of like teenage boys out there in that particular camp. But whatever it is, it's like, you might not be able to change your mind, but at least you've got to know where, you know, there's a lot of things I won't change my mind about, but I know where my views have come from. And I'm confident, I'm happy about that. It's like interrogating yourself in any other way, I think. And it goes back to that sort of humility thing of like, know that you don't know that your sources may be imperfect, and know where your views come from. And then I think productive conversations would follow, and misinformation and conspiracism and all those things would in time probably decrease, because so much of it comes from a distrust, in a sense that, you know, we're all just kind of reacting in this emotional way and we're not really interrogating it enough.
And try not to attack people and call them stupid when you're trying to have a discussion with them.
Yeah, or even just belittle them in more subtle ways. I'm always amazed by fact checking, because it's held up to be such an important thing. And I think on some level, in certain circumstances, fact checkers do a very important job. But it's a bit like administering medicine to the dead. It's like, if people are already believing something totally different, then just saying, nope, you're wrong, is not really going to help. In fact, it's going to intensify the standoff in that situation. And yet it's incredibly common still to just have exactly that kind of arrogant, nope, you're wrong kind of thing. There's a research group that I'm part of, which is kind of looking at this in the context of conspiracy theories within families, where you might have a cross-generational situation in which either the kids or the parents or possibly the grandparents believe in a kind of conspiracy view. And this leads to conflict, you know, within the family setting. Or it might be amongst groups of friends, but I think they're envisioning families. And so then you get into this kind of fact or fiction kind of tense situation where people are doing exactly that kind of dismissive stuff. And we know how harsh families can be to one another. So they're developing a board game in which they can get families to take the sting out of the fact or fiction thing and just play around with the ideas that are in those theories. And maybe they can be just a game, or maybe but they're kind of just trying to kind of dispel some of the tension around that, which I thought was really, really interesting. We tested the game, and there was really nothing in it that suggested one way or another whether these ideas that are kind of recognizable from some of the more mainstream conspiracy beliefs, whether they're right or wrong. There's nothing anywhere in the game. It's just like, you've got to figure out in this round who the conspirators are. And they might be the paid protesters, or they might be the aliens, or they might be something else, but you can just kind of enjoy that with your family. And I kind of, you know, maybe it's a little bit kind of, again, warm and fuzzy, but, you know, I like the idea that we're kind of taking the standoff down a few notches rather than, you know, ratcheting it up.
Thank you, Marcus. I wonder what you want to share as your call to action as we come to a close.
I feel like I've issued quite a lot of, probably more than above my station. I've issued quite a lot of calls to action already. And I hope I haven't sounded too prescriptive. If I say it, I'm also applying it to myself, you know, and I'm applying it to the world and saying, look, here's how we can make the world better. I guess I kind of see things on a world basis rather than a project by project basis. I don't have is it okay just to say, like, let's be kind to each other and nuanced and honest with ourselves about what's happening and give each other and ourselves a break. Can that be my call to action?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a hard one. So good luck, everyone.
It's a hard one. Yeah, exactly. Solidarity is another one, I would say. Stick together, people, because no individual is going to be able to do it all on his or her own or their own.
And how would you like our friends to connect deeper with you? How can they find you?
They can find me online at mjgw.net. I'm currently deciding about whether I want to continue with Twitter or not. So you will find me on Twitter at mjgw as well, but I haven't tweeted since the news of Elon Musk's deal to buy it went through. I may start again, depending on the circumstances. I don't have, at the moment, a public Instagram, so there's nothing to find there. You can also find repeater books and many great titles there. A couple of my books there, Filling the Void and After the Fact, and I hope you enjoy them. Anyone who can't afford to buy them is welcome to write to me, and I'll happily send them a copy.
That's really kind. And we didn't really talk about it, but you are also a musician, and I'm sure you pop up in places playing your bass at times.
Yeah, I would like to shout out my sister, Fauness, Fauness. I'll be playing bass for her this year. And that's a really exciting project she's been doing for the last few years. Fairy rock. Well, she's always renaming it, but it's a really interesting kind of feminist rock project.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Marcus.
Thanks for having me. It's been great to be here.
Thank you for listening and spending your time with us. As always, you can find links to everything we mention in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on allthatweare.org. We give space to our guests to share their perspective without debating it or fact-checking, as this approach allows for deep, unedited conversations from the heart. We trust your discernment and wisdom to take what is useful and challenge what isn't in your own understanding. We offer spaces for discussion and integration in our membership community. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode and it has sparked some inspiration and creativity in you. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible by you, our beautiful community. If you loved this and would like to connect more deeply with us, please join our membership. For less than a tea or coffee a day, you can access our community conversations and benefits such as our app and member gatherings, as well as being a patron whose support makes this podcast happen. Please also hit subscribe and leave us a review wherever you listen so others find us. All That We Are celebrates all that we are already and the untapped potential that lives inside us. It invites the full power of the more than human world, nature, the unseen, our ancestors and our future generations. It reminds us that we never exist in silo, through borders, timelines, or polarity, that in each and every moment, all that we are is here.